Hey, welcome to WGK Public Safety Images. I am WGK, and in this Q&A session, I'm going to answer one of the questions I get asked a lot, and that is about putting watermarks on my photos, and should you or do I, and how do you do it, and what are the advantages and disadvantages. So, without any further ado, let's talk about watermarking your photos.
Battalion 2, engines, 35, 40, 34, and 27, ladder 40, and safety 1, house fire, 3312 Ashley Keith Drive, Hungary, Charlotte.
Welcome to WGK Public Safety Images. I am a public safety photographer in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, and this is my channel, and I use it to post response videos. I also post videos that are all about different departments, companies, equipment, things like that. And then I also post Q&A videos where I try and answer questions that I frequently get as a public safety photographer. I would just ask that you like and subscribe, but otherwise, let's get on to the video. So if you look at my images on most social medias, if you go to Instagram page or Facebook, my photos are in fact watermarked, and there's a specific reason for watermarking them there. But you'll also notice the watermark is a fairly small, innocuous watermark down in the lower right-hand corner. And again, there's a lot of schools of thought on how to watermark and what's the best way to watermark and what are the purposes of the watermark. So let's go through a few of those right now. So let's start with what a watermark is. A watermark is essentially a logo or the photographer's name or some other identifying text that is placed on the photograph so that the photograph can easily be identified as to who took and owns the photo. In theory, watermarks help protect your image. However, nowadays I'm not sure that's really as much the case as it was 20 years ago. But even so, the question becomes, are there benefits to watermarking your photographs? I believe there are a couple of benefits to watermarking photographs, especially photographs that you're putting onto social media. If nothing else, a watermark is like signing your photograph, so anyone who looks at the image knows where the image came from. I have found that there are other social media sites that typically repost photos that I have taken, and the watermark just makes it easier for anyone who sees those photos to identify the actual photographer. Most of the sites reposting are kind of those Instagram aggregating pages that will repost a lot of fire or public safety photos. When my photos show up on these sites, I have found that if I am not already credited, I can contact them and they will credit me as the photographer for the image. And that is ultimately the goal. As I mentioned earlier, I watermark images that I'm going to post to social media because most social media sites will strip out the metadata from the image. So hopefully the watermark is just a little incentive to not copy and use the photograph without my permission. An important note here is that I do not sell my photographs. And in fact, if any of the departments or crews that I photograph want a copy of the image, I typically make those images available to those folks for free, and I will give them a version of the photograph without any watermark on it for their use. With all that said, it's also important to understand that there are some disadvantages to watermarking your photographs. First and foremost, they can ruin the image. The watermark can be distracting and take away from the overall image that you're trying to create. This is especially true if your watermark is large and runs through the entire photograph. The other big disadvantage is that putting a watermark on your image doesn't necessarily protect you from theft and copyright infringement. Modern software can easily remove watermarks, or in the case of watermarks that are a little more subtle and placed in a corner, someone can simply crop out the watermark and then use the image. In this respect, watermarks are more like locks on your car or your house. If someone truly wants to break into your house, they're going to break into your house. The lock discourages the more honest folks from breaking into your house. Also, adding a watermark doesn't create the copyright. The copyright comes into effect as soon as you have taken the photo. Adding a watermark may tell others that the photo is copyrighted, but it does not create the copyright. So if your goal is really to protect your image, there are probably some better ways to do it than adding a watermark. Let me begin this by saying what I'm talking about here is for the hobbyist or the photography enthusiast protecting their images. This is not for a professional photographer or a portrait photographer. Those folks have different needs, and obviously they're making their money from selling their images, so they have to approach that process a little differently. I'll also throw in that putting a watermark on your photo doesn't make it look more professional. Having a more professional looking photo will make it look more professional. Even worse, a poorly done watermark can make it look even more amateurish. But for most photographers, the first thing I tell them is add your information to the metadata in your photograph. As I've mentioned, social media sites are typically thoughtful enough, said with a lot of sarcasm, to strip out the metadata. But if you're going to post your photos on your own website or somewhere else on the internet, metadata is the first step in identifying who the photographer is. If you want to ensure that others aren't taking and using your photographs, you can do a couple other things. First, post lower quality versions of your photographs online. Smaller with less resolution will help discourage copyright infringement. And you will have the higher quality original if it ever becomes an issue as to who actually owns the photograph. Similarly, a lot of photographers will crop their photos slightly so that if they ever had to go to court or some type of mediation, they can produce the entire image, and that serves as proof of the original. Also, retaining the raw files is a good way. That contains all the image information and kind of acts like the DNA or the fingerprint of the photograph to help you prove that it was your photograph. Finally, if you're really concerned about unauthorized use of your photograph, go online and use some of the image search tools and look for unauthorized uses of your photos. The obvious one is Google Image, but there's a couple of other ones out there. Some of them have a cost associated with them, but they can go out and look for other versions of your photographs. So if you decide that after all this you still want to use a watermark, that's fine, and I completely understand. However, I do have a couple of suggestions or thoughts on what makes a good watermark and how they should be used. To begin with, I think the main takeaway here is to think of your watermark as branding, not copyright infringement protection. It should become part of your brand, and so that people, when they see those photographs, will immediately know where it came from. I'm a fan of having watermarks that are simple, typically one color, monochromatic, and small, located in a corner or along the edge of a photograph. Make sure your watermark is legible. I've seen lots of watermarks that are fancy signatures, but if I can't read the name, that doesn't help. Ideally, You want to be able to search whatever is in the watermark and have that search go directly back to you. Otherwise, keep your watermark consistent and apply it in a manner that doesn't detract or ruin the image. And if you use watermarks, just know there are always going to be folks who do not like the use of watermarks on photographs. It tends to be one of those topics that generates a lot of passionate responses when you ask the question. So your choice to use a watermark, I will leave up to you. So there you go. That wraps up this little video on watermarking your photos and whether you should or shouldn't. And hope you found it interesting, learned something, was at least a little bit entertained. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. And otherwise, we'll just see you again in the next video. Thanks. Bye.